Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our marketing rule panel, moderated by Sanjay Lamba, Associate General Counsel of the IAA.
Great. Well, welcome everyone, and good morning, and thank you, and welcome to our panel on the new marketing rule for investment advisors. So it has been a while since I've spoken in front of a live audience, so I'll try to remember not to ask you to mute your mics when you're not speaking. So for the next 15 minutes, our goal really here on this panel is going to be to talk about the new marketing rule from a perspective of some of the implementation challenges that you all should be thinking about, some timeline considerations, and we're really going to be focusing on the expanded definition of advertising. We'll spend a lot of time talking about what's in and what's out. We'll talk about some of the potential pitfalls that might come up as you sort of work through these challenges. And then we'll also talk a little bit about, or maybe a lot about, some of the gray areas that sort of appeared under the rule and maybe various approaches that you can take to sort of address them. And that's a lot to talk about, so I'm glad I'm not here alone, and I have three excellent panelists sitting to my right. Let's maybe start with at the very end there with John Pollard, who is the Global CCO of EJF Capital, and he's based here in the Washington, D.C. area. John and I actually go way back. We worked at the SEC together, and he was on the examination side, and I was in the Chief Counsel's office, and so we had a lot of nice interactions there, and so certainly a lot of experience. Sitting next to John is Jen Klass, a partner at Baker & McKenzie. Jen is based out of the New York office, and if you read her bios in the material, you can see that she has extensive experience counseling investment advisors and financial services firms, and she's a frequent speaker at IAA events. So thank you, Jen, for doing this again. And then sitting to my right, which, sorry to the other speakers, is probably the star of the show here, which is Christine Schepergrove. Christine is a senior counsel in the Division of Investment Management, and Christine was involved in the marketing rule in the adopting stage, and so she's quite familiar with all the comments that have come in, and so she's been a great point person and someone to speak to on the new marketing rule. Prior to joining the SEC, Christine was in private practice, and so we got to interact a lot, and so I'm really happy that you're back here with us. And I will say that Christine is also, I think, certainly among the 14 that the new director mentioned that'll be working on the new rulemaking. We won't talk about those rules, we'll have different panels, but Christine is very busy, so I'm glad that she could make time to be here with us today. So please welcome, thank you, and everyone. So we do have a lot of ground to cover and a lot of issues that we really want to sort of raise for you, but we do want to try to answer some questions, so please feel free to write them out on index cards. There's no chat box here, so and we'll have folks, I think, walking around with index cards, and they'll bring the questions to me. I probably will not be able to get through all of them, and if for some reason we don't, please reach out to any of us, certainly me, and I'd be happy to try to answer your questions. Okay, next slide. Okay, so just a quick, overview of the rule. We're going to assume that by now everyone's sort of become very familiar with the new rule and sort of done the webinars, and we've certainly at the IA have done many many events, and had many calls to talk about it. But there are these provisions of the rule. You have the general prohibitions, which are really essentially just the anti-fraud principles of the Advisors Act applied specifically to marketing-related activities. You have testimonials and endorsements, which is now the sort of the solicitation aspect of the rules, but it also covers paid and unpaid, and cash and non-cash, and so there are specific provisions on that. So there's no longer a ban on testimonials, which is good. Specific guidance on third-party ratings. A lot of provisions on performance. In fact, that's probably the biggest chunk of the rule. And then the definition of advertising, which we will focus on here today. And I mention that because certainly we're not going to be able to get through all of those topics. So we do have a marketing track. We have several breakout sections dedicated purely to the marketing rule. We'll be talking about the advertising and implementation, but we'll have a panel on the solicitation-related activities, presentation of performance, as well as the impact of the marketing rule on private equity. So those breakout sessions will be there. They'll be recorded, but we really want to do a deep dive into the marketing rule. So let's start talking about it substantively now. So obviously the commission was kind enough to provide us an 18-month transition period. We have 8 months left. So really not a lot of time, and I think you'll sort of realize why, and because I'm sure you've already started going through it, but as we sort of speak here, there's a lot to do. Now, some of you may have already started complying with the rule, and that's okay. The SEC staff has put out an FAQ that says that you are permitted to comply with the rule prior to the November 4th compliance date. But remember, it's an all or nothing affair. So you can't just pick and choose your provisions. You either comply with the entire rule or you wait until you're completely ready. So that's the compliance date. So before we move on to the definition of advertising, Christine, let me ask you a question. What can you share with us about the views of the commissioners and your fellow colleagues on the SEC staff?
That is the easiest question I will probably be asked on this panel. So is that an invitation to read my disclaimer? So I'm happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me. Before I jump in on the slides on the definition of advertisement, I just want to state my disclaimer. My comments express my views and do not necessarily reflect those of the commission, the commissioners, or other members of the staff.
Okay, great. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit, Christine, if you want to maybe lead us through some of the highlights of the definition.
Sure, absolutely. So the next few slides talk about the definition of advertisement, and I'm sure folks are very familiar with that, given where we are in the implementation timeline. So we won't go through those in detail, but I did think that I would share a few thoughts, just reminders as folks are parsing the definition of advertisement and working through that threshold question as to whether something is subject to the rule. So first, in thinking about whether something is a compensated or uncompensated testimonial or endorsement, just a reminder that we're analyzing compensated testimonials and endorsements under the second prong of the definition of advertisement, and uncompensated testimonials and endorsements are analyzed under the first prong of the definition of advertisement. And uncompensated testimonials and endorsements, those issues can come up a lot in the social media context. We have another slide on social media, and we'll dig into that topic a little bit more, but just a reminder on that point. The second is that the treatment of an advisor's responses to an unsolicited request under the final rule may be different than advisors may have treated that same scenario responding to an unsolicited request under the current rule. So this is in part because there will be withdrawal of several no action letters as of the compliance date, which is in November. But just a reminder that if advisors, depending on how they were interpreting that letter, advisors may need to note the narrowing of that situation where if an advisor responds to an unsolicited request for information, an advisor still needs to consider whether its response has any template information, any information that is duped out across other communications. And the final thing I'll note just on the definition of advertisement is just a reminder that advertisements about the advisor that are made or disseminated by a related person of the advisor will be deemed to be advertisements of the advisor. So those are just three things to think about as you're working through that definition of advertisement.
So Christine, we were talking a little bit before, and on the unsolicited request, there was a no action letter that was actually given to the IAA that sort of made clear that if you were responding specifically to an unsolicited request, has that changed at all under the new prong of the definition?
So that letter will be withdrawn as of November, and I think it depends on how folks were relying on that letter. So if they were relying on that letter to provide information that is duplicated in response to multiple unsolicited requests, that's something to be mindful of, and revisit the definition of advertisement and know that if they are including template information in response to multiple of those requests, that approach may need to change under the final rule, because the final rule does not have as broad of an exclusion from the definition of advertisement for responses to unsolicited requests.
Okay, thank you. Did you cover prong 2 already?
I did.
Okay, so Jen, obviously the new definition has several changes. You want to maybe walk us through some of the key changes to the definition of the new rule relative to the old?
Sure. As Christine said, a threshold issue is what is the definition of an advertisement, and the definition has expanded more than the prior definition. There are still various exclusions, but those exclusions are more narrow and more nuanced. And so I do think it's important for folks to focus on the definition. Some of the key factors, as Christine just alluded to, the definition of an advertisement expands to or applies to direct and indirect communications. So direct communications is relatively straightforward if the advisor creates material that it disseminates. But with respect to indirect, you really do have to think about communications that are provided to third parties that they are going to be distributing on behalf of the advisor. So promoters, consultants. In addition, communications that are prepared by a related person of the advisor. And then lastly, the concept of indirect communications is also going to incorporate information provided by a third party that the advisor incorporates or includes in its own marketing content. And we'll talk a bit more about liability for third-party content and how to evaluate that. It's important also to note that the definition expressly applies to communications that are directed to private fund investors. And so this is a change from the prior rule, both with respect to what is an advertisement as defined and also in connection with the solicitation and endorsement concepts. The rule does not distinguish between retail and non-retail or retail and institutional investors. The proposal would have done so, but the final rule as adopted takes into consideration the nature of the audience for purposes of the general prohibitions and the overall context of the advertisement, but there's no different standard. And then lastly, as we'll talk about, and I know there's going to be a lot more focus on in other sessions, this concept of testimonials and endorsements really does incorporate not just statements by clients or third parties, but also solicitation and referral arrangements. And that was really the mechanism that the staff used to merge the two prior rules, the advertising and cash solicitation rules, together.
So Jen, we mentioned the general prohibitions. Do you want to just maybe highlight some of the key aspects of those?
Yeah, I mean, in general, the general prohibitions are general anti-fraud provisions. They're sort of akin to the general content standards to some degree on the FINRA side. But some important things to understand are that they introduce the concept of substantiation into the rule itself. This is not really a new concept, but firms need to make sure that they can substantiate material statements of fact upon demand by the Commission, and so that obviously has implications in terms of implementation and the records of advertisements and the material that's used to substantiate any factual claims. It's also important to note that there are broad requirements around ensuring that your communications are fair and balanced, and that they include a discussion of any benefits balanced against any risks and limitations. And so that may require that advisors go back through or reconsider existing advertisements in advance of the implementation date. One of the key changes in the new rule was that it removes the prohibition on past specific recommendations. So advisors are allowed to refer to specific investment advice that they provide or have provided in the past, again, so long as it's fair and balanced. And that's really designed to ensure that there's no cherry picking and to incorporate some of the principles of the prior no action letters that the staff had put out, even though many of those letters are going to be going away. And that anti-cherry picking concern also applies with respect to performance periods. So firms should be thoughtful about how they're presenting the performance that they're showing with respect to the actual time periods that they're using for those materials.
And I'll just, and I know Jen mentioned this, but just to sort of specify, clear that these general prohibitions apply to all your marketing-related activities. So I know we'll be working through some of the performance-related stuff that you have to comply with, some of the other aspects, but always keep that in mind that this is an overarching principles that you need to keep in mind. So Jen, there wasn't a lot of discussion about social media, but there was some in the adopting release. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the changes on that front?
Yeah, one of the key changes was that the commission incorporated the concept of adoption and entanglement, which is a concept that many firms are used to, particularly on the FINRA side, but had really never been expressly applied to investment advisor communications. So with respect to whether or not an advisor is responsible for third-party content, the question is going to be whether or not the advisor has adopted that content, essentially by endorsing or approving that content, or whether they've become entangled in the creation of that content. And that is particularly relevant to social media because there's a lot of interaction with third parties and their content through social media. The other thing to keep in mind is that the commission was clear that an advisor is not going to be responsible for third-party posts on the advisor's website or social media properties, so long as the advisor is not sort of cherry-picking and is applying an objective standard for reviewing that content. So it's reasonable that an advisor might want to remove content posted by a third party that may be inconsistent with use guidelines, or other objective criteria, but you shouldn't be subjectively pulling out certain posts and leaving others or reorganizing the posts. If an advisor engages in that activity, then it will become responsible for that content. And lastly, 2 points. One, advisors aren't going to be responsible for the content of the personal social media use of their employees, so long as there are reasonable policies and procedures and monitoring in place with respect to those personal websites and posts. And then the commission also removed the ban on testimonials, which is a huge issue across sort of all advertising. It's not limited to social media, but testimonials created particular friction in the social media context because of, again, the interactions with third parties and the likes and endorsements kinds of features. Again, testimonials are permitted, but subject to the requirements in the rule that apply to testimonials and endorsements. And if they're compensated, then the additional requirements that will weigh in.
So Christine, I think one, and there was some discussion in the adopting release about social media and hyperlinking of disclosures. Any sort of comment you can make in terms of how much flexibility firms have with respect to be able to hyperlink if they're using social media and provide necessary disclosures?
Sure. So I think any hyperlinking that is involved in social media is going to depend on what is hyperlinked to, where the hyperlink is placed. So it's going to be very facts and circumstances dependent. And it's, as Jen mentioned, a very difficult analysis, even under both prongs of the definition of advertisement, because you can have compensated social media interaction, you can have uncompensated testimonials and endorsements that can be considered an advertisement under the rule. And so I think when analyzing hyperlinks, you're kind of back to adoption and entanglement, assuming that we're in the uncompensated world of things. You're going to look at whether the advisor adopted the content, so did something to act on the content after it was created, or if the advisor was involved in the front end and therefore is entangled in creating that content. So I think those are still the big picture concepts to keep in mind. I don't think it's going to be a cut and dry answer as to when a hyperlink is going to be subject to the rule or not. So it's going to, again, depend on where the hyperlink is placed and what is hyperlinked to, and if the advisor was involved in helping create or shape that information that the hyperlink sends the client or the prospective investor to.
Thank you. So I guess before we start talking about some of the implementation challenges, our CLE code word is highway. Highway. And I do want to, so I have been getting questions, which are great, and I'll go through them. I got a question on performance advertising, which I'll pass off to our performance breakout session. So I guess what I want to say is if you have questions in general about the marketing rule, feel free to send them to me, and I'll make sure that the panelists on the breakout sessions get them as well. So keep on bringing those questions in. So John, let's turn to you to talk about some of the practical and some of the implementation issues. I think we've talked, and I think we all agree that sort of establishing a very specific timeline is critical. Do you want to maybe walk us through some of the high-level timeline, and then we'll go into a little bit more detail on some of these?
Sure, certainly. I think it's important to take, from a strategic perspective, to acknowledge that when you're trying to implement substantive changes to a business function that's as integrated as marketing, you have to address the behavioral element as much as the analytical component. So when you're building out your timeline, you need to get buy-in from all the folks involved in your marketing process. You need to give them time to preview the rule, socialize those changes, train them up, let them digest it, so their buy-in is critical to the success of implementing the rule. The first step before you even build that timeline out is exactly how we started here, knowing the rule, because you're going to be the single source of truth for your firm, guiding them through this process. There will be a lot of questions that come up, decisions that need to be made. You need to be familiar with the rule so you're better informed to help out your firm. What documents are in scope, what topics are covered, what content needs to be adjusted going forward. As you build out your timeline, you want to layer in your folks. At our firm, we have a pretty healthy representation across departments that are involved in the marketing process. With that comes a great trade-off. We have a lot of redundancies and a crisp product goes out the door, but there are a lot of processes and familiarity and understanding with the existing regime. And you have to layer in time to acclimatize your folks to those changes that are coming down the pike. So that's why you see on this timeline here, there's a lot of behavioral elements and soft skills on the top line as you get to the analytical components. So anytime you have a rule change or a new rule coming out, the first step you do is your gap analysis. What are your current policies, procedures, processes, and how do they square with the new rule that's coming into effect? This rule tends to deal with a lot of communications. We layered in our gap analysis in 3 stages. I think our firm is like most other firms where we review marketing documents before they go out the door. First step for us was building a catalog of documents that we saw in the normal course that came across our desk. Then we started to review the content of that material as it came through. And as we got more familiar with the rule, we reviewed the rule in parallel with the existing framework and the new rule. And this gave us time to preview the types of changes with our content providers that are coming down the pike. It's been a helpful kind of step for us. It's been a free bite at the apple on both sides of the aisle for us, but I would highly commend you do the same. And then as you're building out that corpus, that schedule, you have to reach beyond what comes across your desk and start looking out of the communications and documents that come out not in the normal course that you typically consider marketing. Think about the reports and information you provide in connection with your contracts, your sub-advisory agreements, your side letters, your IMAs. They may not come across your desk, but you need to go ascertain and analyze them. Certainly you need to look at all the communications that come out from your third parties, your administrators, your service providers, your third-party marketers, even your in-house technology solutions and any reports that come out of that. And lastly, I'd commend that you may want to take a look at or utilize some of your surveillance tools and communications aspects to see if your folks, your portfolio team, your risk team, are giving ad hoc commentary to investors or clients to help kind of address the market opportunity.
Thanks, John. Okay, so let's dive a little deeper into some of these. We've been talking about the definition of advertising. John, I know you and I have spoken, and you're sort of going through the process of assessing all your communications to see what's in and out. You want to maybe talk a little bit about that and some of the surprises or issues that you've identified?
Sure, yeah, we may have addressed some of this, but again, it is your gap analysis. What you're trying to build here is a corpus of documents that are currently maybe out of scope, but are in scope under the new regime so that you can start to analyze that. I would say the biggest kind of pressure point here is the third parties and the communications that are going out on your behalf or indirectly, depending if you're reading the proposed rule or the final rule. you can't start your analysis until you have the entire universe of documents, which are laid out here.
Great. So, Jen, any sort of thoughts here on sort of as firms go through assessing sort of communications? And I mean, we have a list here, and most of these are from the adopting release.
Yep.
And the responses to unsolicited requests, which Christine talked about earlier, there is a caveat, right? But generally speaking, as long as they're not boilerplate. But are there any other issues here that firms should be aware of, or opportunities, perhaps?
Well, I think there's lots of opportunities, as John mentioned, to sort of reevaluate the flow of communications. I mean, obviously, the definition of an advertisement doesn't capture every communication that leaves the firm, but I think it's important to evaluate what, as he said, would be a gap that would be included under the new rule that wasn't. You know, some of the issues that firms have focused on is this concept of templated communications. This has always been an issue. It particularly comes up in the RFP process, which for many firms is a significant flow. And just ensuring that you're thinking about how the rule applies in that context. I mean, if there are stock answers and standardized responses to RFPs that the firm has reviewed and approved, then it's very hard to argue that those aren't going to be considered an advertisement, even if the RFP itself is addressed to a single potential client. So I think you have to think about those sorts of issues. Another thing that comes up is hypothetical performance. We've been spending a lot of time with clients talking about what is and is not hypothetical performance and the additional requirements that apply. So those are the sorts of things that I think firms have been particularly focused on. I do think it's important to ensure or to think about the fact that highly customized communications, account statements, those sorts of things are going to be out of the bucket, but these aren't exclusive buckets. And so there may be components, for example, of a quarterly report that goes out that will be considered an advertisement, even if it might be customized to a particular client's account and their performance.
And it would be because they're trying to maybe offer up some additional advisory services and
to existing clients, yeah. I mean, we haven't really talked about that, but the definition applies not only to prospective clients, but also to existing clients where you're trying to offer new products and services. If it's just standardized communications that effectively reflect the advice that's being provided, those aren't going to be considered advertisements.
So, Christine, I think as we sort of talk to our members about the definition and what's in and what's out, some of the surprises or some of the questions have come up around sort of intermediaries and third-party content. You want to maybe walk us through some of what the Commission sort of put out here in terms of things to consider?
Sure, I'm happy to. And I think this is assessing whether something is an indirect communication is one of the hardest parts of parsing the definition of advertisement. And it becomes even more complicated when you have an interactive medium like social media. And so here, this slide is focusing on what types of third-party content would be attributed to the advisor. What does the advisor have to own as its own content, depending on whether it has adopted existing content from a third party or whether the advisor is entangled and therefore involved in the front end. So again, we're back to those concepts of adoption and entanglement when analyzing whether something is an indirect communication of the advisor. So I know we've talked a lot about A&E and adoption and entanglement, so I won't go through that again. But just to highlight a few of the circumstances that are called out in the release. So the release does talk about situations where an advisor collaborates with a third party to create a marketing piece. And maybe, for example, the advisor makes some comments that the third party doesn't accept and then sends that communication out, or the third party makes changes that the advisor doesn't approve before that communication goes out. So that's one example where there is some color on that in the release. Another situation is master feeder funds and fund of funds when you have a sub-manager or another advisor providing marketing materials that gives to advisor number 2, and advisor number 2 is the client-facing advisor, and how do those situations work? A third example that is discussed in the release is when an advisor incorporates third-party information into its own communications and then sends that out. And then the release finally also discusses situations where an advisor provides data, say performance data, to an intermediary that disseminates advertisements for the advisor. So maybe an advisor provides performance information to a newspaper or an online publication. And so these are 4 ways that advisors interact with intermediaries, and how the question comes up, when is that an indirect communication that the advisor has to be responsible for under the final rule?
Great. Jen, is there anything you want to maybe add here from your talking to clients, some issues that have come up in addition, or?
Are you asking me? I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
I didn't know if you said Jen or John. Yeah, no, I mean, I think Christine covered a lot of it. I do think that one thing we didn't talk about on the prior slide, I just wanted to highlight, is this concept of brand communications, because there are a lot of firms that, particularly on their social media sites, promote the brand more generally, but don't actually refer to the advisory services. So they might talk about job openings or charitable or philanthropic work, or other activities of the firm. And I think that so long as those are really what's sort of discussed as brand communications, they wouldn't be subject to the advertising rule. But again, you have to be thoughtful about the context and content of those communications.
Yeah, that's a question that we get asked a lot.
Yep.
John, you want to maybe chime in? I know you've sort of been going through this exercise and looking at some of your third-party content.
Yeah, I think the most challenging aspect is the third-party marketers. I think we're fortunate in the respect that our commercial terms are pretty harmonized across our third-party marketers, but I can see a realm where other advisors and other peers have different fee schedules, different rates, different aspects to consider, and that disclosure can get pretty hairy over time. I think we're at the process where we're reviewing those agreements and revisiting those agreements. I will say those conversations are going exactly how you would expect. Those that are familiar with the rule require less education and vice versa. But everyone recognizes that these changes are coming, probably more so in this room than other aspects of the industry.
So John, let's stay with you for a minute. So obviously part of this process is going to be looking at your policies and procedure and updating them. Do you want to maybe highlight some of the issues that you've identified early on and things that you're thinking about?
Yeah, again, stepping back, when you're thinking about how to address these things, I think it's important to note that in November, when all the no action letters fall away and the framework starts to be revisited, you want your answers to be rooted in an analytical nature as to why you're doing something and the rationale behind it. Because I think it's going to take time for market practices to reemerge and industry consensus to come around things. So when you're asked in November and December why we're able to say something, why we're not able to say something, you want to know that rule. So when you go to assess your policies and procedures and your processes, now that you have this corpus of documents and content to review, it's important to build your plan of action, analyze it against the rule that you know. And then this is where you start to broaden your circle outside of your compliance and legal realm. This is where you start to build in your key stakeholders and let them know and preview it for them, the changes, the plan of action, and the issues that are coming up down the pike. I think those interactions actually go very well, as you would expect. They need time to digest that as well before you start to going to a larger group. But we talk about all sorts of aspects. We have broken our conversations down not by departments, and each department can overlap firm to firm, but we view those groups in 4 different respects. Your content creators, these are people that actually develop your market commentary, your performance calculations. The second group is the actual document creators, those that take the document, the content, whether it's duped out or not, to Christine's point, and develop a document or pull that information for another document. The third group is we talk about the document distributors. Again, there may be overlap here, but there may not, especially when third-party marketers are involved. And the last is anyone who can help you on the record retention side, anyone who can help you implement a systemic way to retain all the documents and communications in connection with your books and records requirements.
So Jen, do you have anything to add in terms of what folks should be thinking about as they assess their policies and procedures?
I mean, I do want to highlight what was said about training, because updating the written policies and procedures is obviously a critical piece of implementation. But what's even more important, to John's point, is ensuring that the people involved in the production and review of the marketing material, both on the business side and the legal and compliance side, really understand that this is a significant shift. And that they're going to have to, in many respects, potentially revisit existing communications, update disclosures. So it is, the policies and procedures piece is obviously very important, but what's more important is ensuring that there's a comprehensive sort of process and that people buy into and understand what is changing and what that new process should look like.
And one element I neglected to include, because these lights are pretty bright, you also want to, when you peel back the curtain, the rule does afford some avenues to market that you previously were foreclosed upon. So that's been a helpful tool in these conversations, in that trade-off of showing what we have to adjust and what we're allowed to kind of pursue under the new rule.
And I do think that one area that firms are spending a lot of time talking about is performance, obviously. And so to the extent that there are groups or internal folks that are dedicated to the calculation or verification of performance, they very much need to be incorporated into the implementation process early on, because the standardized time periods for performance are now required. But the rule also goes into composite construction issues, and we've seen a number of firms who, in the process of the implementation, are sort of revisiting past practices about how they build composites and how they show performance, and reevaluating how those rules might apply in the current structure.
Sorry, yeah, we're obviously getting a lot of questions up here, so, and that's fine, I asked for them, so keep them coming.
I didn't think you were going to send them all to me, though.
No. Well,
I shouldn't have sat so close to you.
yeah, well, yeah, like I said, you're the star here, and you have all the answers. Well, actually, before we get to questions, and I think we'll try to get to some, there are certain other considerations that you have to think about, and Jen, do you want to maybe highlight some other additional considerations here?
Yeah, a number of these we've already mentioned. I'll just say, record keeping is something that firms should be looking at because there are material changes to the record keeping requirements or new records that weren't previously required. And so you do need to think about that. Solicitation and referral arrangements, that is an area where, given the expansive nature of testimonials and endorsements, communications, particularly paid advertisements or, quote, advertising relationships that firms previously might have excluded from the cash solicitation rule, are going to be subject to the marketing rule. And so it is very important not just to reevaluate your true referral arrangements and placement agent agreements, but also to consider whether there are just plain online advertising or other advertising arrangements in effect that need to fold into the requirements of the rule.
John, you want to maybe add here? I mean, I'm sure you're thinking about some of your arrangements and agreements. How's that going?
Yeah, it's as you would expect. Again, you have varying levels of experience and familiarity, and the market practices that are out there today won't exist tomorrow. So, everyone's trying to do the right thing. It's just about the existing process and recognizing the shift that needs to transpire. We are probably in the 7th inning of this, and it's taken probably 6 or 7 months to get there so far. Yeah.
Jen, you may have said this, I'm sorry, but in thinking about solicitation and referral arrangements, there's obviously a lead time involved here. And the November 4th date is fast approaching, so what do you recommend firms are sort of transitioning or thinking about contracting now?
Yeah, I mean, much like the implementation process John laid out, generally, I think you have to start by cataloging what your existing relationships are, thinking about what other types of relationships would now be included that weren't previously. And then, many of our clients are working on updating their form agreements to incorporate the new statutory disqualification and other provisions. Particularly firms who have online referral arrangements may need to change the user interface, or there may be a lead time involved from a technology perspective in making changes. And so those are all considerations that sort of need to go into this timeline. So, when November 4th comes, hopefully all of this work was done in advance, so that you're in a position to comply with the rule. I think it's a heavy lift if you wait all the way until November to start looking at solicitation and referral arrangements.
So we did talk about training. John, I know that's certainly something that's going to be coming down the pike, if not already for you. Do you want to maybe highlight some things that folks should think about on training?
Definitely. So I would say the training is the culmination of all the hard work that you've gotten to at this point. The implementation is there. The policies and procedures are ready to go. Your disclosures are probably augmented. Obviously, you can adopt that early. You don't need much buy-in ahead of that unless you have a lot of real estate that you're going to lose to your documents. But the training process is, again, a buy-in process. And as you've kind of broadened your circles, the training is critical. We have broken our training down similar to this conference. The first segment deals with a subset of our individuals dealing with the definition and prohibitions. The second segment deals with the people that help us with performance calculations, which is a pretty broad group. And then the last one deals with testimonials and endorsements. I'd say, again, you have a wide disparity of experience across your firm that's involved with these things. And they're very abstract concepts if you just read the rule on its face. So the more you can pull real-life examples historically into your training, the more fruitful it becomes. So the last thing you want is a meeting or a training where people walk away with different understandings of things. So it's important that everyone has a crystal clear understanding of what's expected of them and what's going to happen in the future.
Great. So let's turn to some questions here. And I'm sorry, Christine, I did give you a lot of questions, and normally I would read them out for you, but I think there's some consistent questions relating to social media and third-party content. Do you want to maybe just address some of them, or generally address them?
Sure, absolutely. So I can start with one here that asks about record keeping and how should advisors think about record keeping information on third-party sites, information related to social media, and how frequently should advisors expect to be able to capture that. So just big picture reminder that advisors do have 204-2 obligations. And so if advisors find that they're unable to record keep something that's used on a social media platform because they can't find a vendor that will do that, or because they're, for whatever reason, unable to capture information that could be an advertisement of the advisor on that platform, that advisors really need to think about whether that's an appropriate place to be advertising if they're unable to comply with their Rule 204-2 obligations. And the release and the rule don't specify exactly how advisors should comply. We do want to make sure that rule is evergreen so that there is some flexibility there as the ability to record keep things changes with technology and evolves. So just a reminder that advisors may need to think about, if we cannot comply with our 204-2 obligations under the books and records rule, maybe this is not a place where we are able to engage on social media and advertise on that platform at this time. Okay. So sorry, go ahead.
Oh, please.
One other one that I wanted to address, it's not explicitly about social media, but I think it's a really great question that hits on a threshold issue, meaning is it an advertisement? And therefore, do we need to consider the rest of the rule? And the question is, you said that uncompensated testimonials and endorsements come under prong 1 of the definition of advertisement. Does that mean that these ads don't have to include the clear and prominent layer of promoter disclosure? So this is a great question because I like to think of the first prong and the second prong of the definition of advertisement as two funnels. And regardless of how you get into the rule, you are still subject to the rest of the rule that might apply. So if this person decided they have an uncompensated testimonial endorsement that meets the other requirements under prong 1 of the definition, is to more than one person, is about the advisor's securities-related advisory services, checks all those boxes, okay, it's in the rule. you would then continue to analyze the rest of the rule. So then go to subsection B, and what does that say? And so just because something is an uncompensated testimonial and endorsement doesn't mean that it's not subject to other parts of the rule that could apply. So I would just think of that as a threshold issue. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily not having to do clear and prominent when it would otherwise be a requirement under the rule. So I think it's a great question, and it's a very important one to get right at the beginning, because if you find you're not subject to the rule, then you can save a lot of time.
Any others you want to address, or I think we got them all?
So there's one other one about, and I'll share some with Jen in case she also wants to look on and share the joy of social media questions. So this one is, can you give an example of third-party content for social media? So here, third-party content, it could be the hyperlinking scenario that we discussed. An advisor could include a hyperlink on its website, and where that hyperlink goes and whether the advisor was involved in helping out with the content as to where that hyperlinked information, that is where you look to adoption and entanglement. So that's one example. So for example, if an advisor includes a hyperlink to a bunch of really great reviews about the advisor on a third-party site, that's something that's going to need to be analyzed. Was the advisor involved in the front end in helping coach clients to say great things and put it on this website? Or is it a hyperlink to just unfiltered information on an advisor's Yelp page? So when we're talking about third-party content and social media, that's one way of looking at it, is if the advisor is hyperlinking to something else.
Any of those questions that you want?
Yeah, I mean, there's a question about employees and what they post on their personal social media accounts. And the question, I think, is, if the advisor is exercising supervision and oversight, can you exclude those communications as an advertisement? And what does it really mean to exercise supervision and oversight? Does that mean that the advisor has to monitor and log what the employee is saying on their personal social media pages? And I think the answer to that is no. You have to have an appropriate control environment, and the rule doesn't dictate what that is. But you have to think about sort of what makes sense and have a social media policy, particularly with respect to the use of personal social media, that you feel comfortable you're able to implement, either because you are capturing personal social media posts or because you have certifications or other controls in place to make sure you have some visibility into what your employees are not doing.
Okay, so do have a lot of questions here. We're not going to be able to get through all of them, I'm sorry. But I will pass on the ones that our other panels can cover. And I'll be here for a little while up on the stage, and I think my fellow panelists will be here as well, so feel free to come up. But I do want to address the issue of staff guidance and FAQs. Christine, one of the questions that I guess asked a lot is, are you going to be publishing any additional guidance or FAQs? To date, you've published 2. And there are some areas under the rule where there are some gray areas and some questions. So what are your thoughts? I know you can't speak for your colleagues and what you will and won't do, but what are your thoughts on sort of issuing guidance? And I guess more specifically, as we've been talking about, there's obviously a lead time for implementation, right? And so I think folks are concerned that you spend a lot of time and effort adopting policies and procedures. The date November 4th comes along, and then a month later, you issue guidance that sort of upends all that. So what are your thoughts on the staff issuing guidance or FAQs or the possibility of that?
Sure, thank you for that question, and I think it's an understatement to say there are a few gray areas. So we know that there are lots of gray areas with the marketing rule and its implementation, and that's somewhat an effect of having a principles-based rule. And so we understand that folks do want guidance on many topics, and I can't comment on the timing of any FAQs, but I can provide some color onto into the types of things that would be FAQ eligible in case it's helpful for this audience as you think about whether it's worth asking for relief on certain topics. And so first I would think about whether your question involves an impossibility to comply with the entire rule. And so what we've seen folks come forward with is well, if we comply with this part of subsection D, the performance reporting part of the rule, then it's going to violate the general prohibitions because it's going to be misleading. And if that's your conundrum, I would really encourage folks to take it back, try and think of creative ways to make that not misleading, even though you may not like complying with subsection D of the rule, but try and think about how you can be creative and still include disclosure that allows you to comply with the performance reporting requirements and then also avoid any type of misleading advertisement. And then I think if you still find yourself in a place where you think that it's impossible to comply with certain parts of the rule, then I think that is something that you can consider bringing to the staff. I would also suggest taking a look at the adopting release and the proposing release to see if the staff has considered the issue that you're going to bring forward. Because I have found that in comment letters and in the proposing release and in the adopting release, when I look at it, I can see that, the staff received comment on this topic, they considered it, and then they decided to go with X. So if you are bringing a question to the staff that it appears we have already considered and decided to go a different way on, whether it's for a policy reason or for another choice, I would think about that before coming in and asking for relief, just so that folks are, making the most productive use of their time, because I know everyone's really busy right now trying to move toward implementation.
Right. I forgot to say our last CLE code word. It's file, like file your ADV.
Can I just wanted to add, the question about will there be FAQs is the question I get most asked also. And I think given the timeline and all of the moving parts related to implementation, I don't think firms should be waiting for SEC guidance. I do think that the better approach is to go back to the principles that are underlying the principles-based rule. And to John's point earlier, develop positions that you view as reasonable and in line with sort of those principles, where there are gray areas or where there are things that may be unique to your particular business. I would also add a plug for the IAA. I know they have a great marketing implementation group, and I think having discussions with industry peers around sort of what other firms are doing will help to facilitate sort of an industry approach to certain controversial or unclear aspects of the rules. But I would really encourage people to move forward and sort of, do the best that they can with the information that's available, rather than holding back and waiting on implementation until you get more clarity. Because I don't know that clarity will come before the November 4th date does.
Yeah, that's great advice. And Christine, we really appreciate, I know we've had a lot of interactions about the new marketing rule and your openness to be able to talk to us and give us your thoughts. And so we continue to look forward to working with you on potential FAQs and bringing issues to your attention. So, but we really appreciate the staff being responsive to us.
Definitely. Happy to talk further about
Great.
FAQs.
So that brings us to the end of the session. I really I want to thank you all for participating and listening today, but I especially want to thank our great guests, our speakers here. So just please join me in thanking. So we'll stick around here, at least I will, if you have any questions. We are going into breakouts, so we have about a 10-minute break, I guess, now. So enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you.